History Secrets.
On the pages of the New Testament, the name Judas Iscariot is linked to one of the most dramatic moments in Christian history. He is remembered as the disciple who handed Jesus over to the authorities, the man whose betrayal opened the way for the arrest that would precede the crucifixion. But over the centuries, a question has emerged that continues to intrigue scholars and readers. What if the story of Judas is not as simple as it seems? There is an ancient manuscript that presents a completely different perspective, a text known as the Gospel of Judas. This document preserves an unexpected dialogue between Jesus and the disciple whom Christian tradition associated with betrayal. According to this ancient text, Judas may not have been just a traitor. He may have played a much more complex role, perhaps even a necessary one within a greater plan. This possibility raises a question that spans centuries of debate. Was Judas Iscariot truly the villain of the story? Or was his figure interpreted differently in ancient traditions that are little known today? To understand this mystery, we need to return to the very setting in which the story began. 1st century Judea. To understand the figure of Judas Iscariot, we must first observe the historical environment in which the events of the New Testament took place. In the 1st century, the region of Judea lived under the rule of the Roman Empire. The Roman presence was maintained through military governors, heavy taxation, and constant political tension. Many groups within Jewish society awaited the arrival of a Messiah, a leader sent by God who would restore Israel and free the people from foreign domination. In this context appears Jesus of Nazareth, an itinerant preacher who traveled through villages and cities, announcing the arrival of the kingdom of God. According to the Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus gathered around him a group of 12 disciples. Among them was Judas Iscariot. The canonical Gospels describe Judas as the one responsible for handing Jesus over to the religious authorities of Jerusalem. Matthew, chapter 26, verses 14 and 15, recounts that Judas went to the chief priests. He asked how much he would receive for handing Jesus over. According to the text, the agreed amount was 30 pieces of silver. This detail would become one of the most well-known symbols associated with the figure of Judas. But the biblical narrative also raises questions that remain open. Why would a disciple who followed Jesus for so long make such a drastic decision? Was it only greed? Or were there more complex motivations behind this episode? To explore these possibilities, we need to look beyond the well-known Gospels and also consider ancient texts that circulated among the early Christian communities. Among them, a manuscript that remained lost for centuries, the Gospel of Judas. For many centuries, the Gospel of Judas was known only through references made by early Christian writers. One of the most important was Irenaeus of Lyon. Around the 2nd century, Irenaeus wrote against various groups he considered heretical. Among those texts, he mentioned a gospel that presented Judas in a very different way from the dominant tradition. According to Irenaeus, this document was part of a set of writings associated with currents of early Christianity known as Gnostic. For a long time, it was believed that this gospel had completely disappeared. But at the end of the 20th century, a surprising discovery occurred. In the 1970s, an ancient manuscript was found in Egypt. This codex, written in the Coptic language, contained several ancient religious texts. Among them was the Gospel of Judas. After a long process of restoration and translation, the document began to be studied by specialists in the history of early Christianity. The manuscript is usually dated between the 3rd and 4th centuries, but many scholars believe that the original text may have been written much earlier, perhaps around the 2nd century. This discovery brought back a fascinating question. How exactly does this gospel describe Judas Iscariot? And why is its version of the story so different from the narrative found in the Gospels of the New Testament? When researchers began to carefully analyze the Gospel of Judas, they noticed that the text presents a very unusual dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. In this manuscript, several disciples appear confused by the teachings of Jesus. They do not fully understand the spiritual meaning of his words. But there is a surprising exception. Judas Iscariot. According to the Gospel of Judas, he would be the only disciple capable of understanding certain hidden teachings. At a certain moment, the text describes Jesus calling Judas for a private conversation. In this dialogue, Jesus reveals profound aspects about the spiritual nature of the world. The manuscript presents a view influenced by currents of Gnostic thought. Within this tradition, the material world was often seen as imperfect or illusory. The true reality would exist in the spiritual realm. According to this interpretation, Jesus would have come into the world to reveal a spiritual knowledge capable of liberating human soul. This knowledge was called gnosis, or inner knowledge. Within this context, the role of Judas takes on an unexpected meaning. Instead of a traitor driven by greed, he appears as someone who understands a difficult mission, a mission that the other disciples cannot accept. In one of the most discussed passages of the Gospel of Judas, Jesus says something that completely changes the traditional interpretation of the story. He states that Judas will have a special role among the disciples. According to the text, Judas would be the one who hands over the human body of Jesus. This phrase has been analyzed with great attention by scholars. Within the Gnostic view presented in the manuscript, the physical body of Jesus would not represent his true essence. The true identity of Christ would be connected to the spiritual world. In this context, handing over the body could mean releasing the spirit. If this interpretation is correct, the act of Judas would no longer be only an act of betrayal. It could be seen as part of a broader spiritual plan, an action necessary for the final events of Jesus' life to be fulfilled. This idea completely transforms the traditional image of Judas from a traitor to someone who consciously participates in a process that would lead to the fulfillment of Jesus' mission. But it is important to remember that this interpretation belongs to a specific current of early Christianity. It does not correspond to the narrative preserved in the canonical Gospels. To understand this difference, we need to observe how the early leaders of the Church reacted to texts such as the Gospel of Judas. In the early centuries of Christianity, various communities interpreted the teachings of Jesus in different ways. Some of these communities produced texts that are now known as apocryphal Gospels. These writings presented dialogues, teachings, and narratives that did not always align with the Gospels that would later be considered canonical. As Christianity expanded, religious leaders began to establish criteria to define which texts would be recognized as authoritative within the tradition of the Church. This process led to the formation of the canon of the New Testament. During this period, many writings were rejected or considered incompatible with the doctrine that was being consolidated. Among them were several texts associated with Gnostic thought. The Gospel of Judas appears exactly in this context. Christian writers, such as Irenaeus of Lyon, argued that this gospel distorted the message transmitted by the apostles. According to them, the idea that Judas acted on Jesus' instruction contradicted the tradition preserved in the earliest Christian communities. For this reason, texts like The Gospel of Judas were not included in the collection of books that would form the New Testament, but despite being rejected as doctrinal authority, these documents remain extremely valuable for historians. They reveal the diversity of interpretations that existed in the early centuries of Christianity. When we analyze the Gospel of Judas alongside the Gospels of the New Testament, we perceive that they represent very different views of the same historical figure. In the canonical Gospels, Judas Iscariot is portrayed as the disciple who betrayed Jesus. Matthew, chapter 26, verses 47 to 50, describes the moment when Judas arrives at the garden accompanied by guards. He identifies Jesus with a kiss. This gesture would become one of the most well-known symbols of betrayal in Christian tradition. In the other Gospels, similar elements also appear. The act of Judas is presented as the beginning of the sequence of events that would lead to the trial and crucifixion. In contrast, in the Gospel of Judas, the scenario is completely different. The text does not describe Judas as someone driven by greed. Instead, he appears as a disciple who receives special teachings from Jesus. According to this narrative, Judas understands something that the other disciples failed to perceive: the true spiritual nature of Jesus' mission. This difference reveals a fascinating aspect of the history of early Christianity. During the first centuries, there were communities that interpreted the figure of Judas in very different ways. For some traditions, he was the traitor. For others, he may have been the only disciple who fully understood the spiritual plan revealed by Jesus. This tension between interpretations is part of the historical process of the formation of religious traditions. When modern scholars analyze the Gospel of Judas, they seek to understand not only the content of the text, but also the historical context in which it emerged. Most researchers believe that the Gospel was written by a community linked to Gnostic currents of early Christianity. These groups developed spiritual interpretations quite different from those that became dominant within the Church. For many Gnostic traditions, inner spiritual knowledge was the central element of salvation. That knowledge would reveal the true divine origin of the human soul. Within this view, Jesus often appears as a teacher who transmits secret teachings to disciples capable of understanding them. In this context, the figure of Judas takes on a very specific symbolic meaning. He would represent the disciple who receives a deeper revelation, the one who understands something that remains hidden from the others. For this reason, some scholars interpret the Gospel of Judas as a work that seeks to redefine the image of Judas within a particular spiritual tradition, not necessarily as a historical account of events, but as a theological reflection constructed within a specific community. This perspective helps explain why the text presents such a different view from the narrative preserved in the canonical Gospels. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Gospel of Judas is precisely the way it forces us to reconsider ancient questions. Who was Judas Iscariot, really? Was he only the disciple who betrayed his master for money? Or did his figure become, over time, a symbol constructed within different theological narratives? The texts of the New Testament present a clear answer within the Christian tradition that became established. Judas appears as the one who handed Jesus over, and this action triggered the events that would lead to the crucifixion. On the other hand, the Gospel of Judas presents a radically different reading. In this text, Judas would be the disciple who understood a deep spiritual secret. He would have played a necessary role for the mission of Jesus to be completed. These two interpretations coexist within the vast panorama of the history of early Christianity. They reflect theological debates that took place during the first centuries. debates that helped shape the traditions we know today. Perhaps the figure of Judas remains so intriguing precisely because it stands at the center of one of the most decisive moments of the Christian narrative. Between loyalty and betrayal, between interpretation and history, between silence and mystery, many civilizations flourished before ours. Some dominated vast territories. Others disappeared, almost without leaving traces. What remains are clues scattered through time, silent monuments, fragmented manuscripts, stories passed down through generations. Each discovery brings us a little closer to the truth. But history still holds many secrets. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.